Hey, welcome to the Real Squabble. Today we're discussing forgiveness. Hey, who hasn't been hurt by the actions or words of another? Perhaps a parent constantly criticized you growing up, a colleague sabotaged a project, or your partner had an affair. Or maybe you had a traumatic experience, such as being physically or emotionally abused by someone close to you. Those wounds can get a grip on you and leave lasting feelings of resentment, bitterness, and anger, sometimes even hatred. We're going to discuss that today. But first, let me remind you to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Real Squabble. And leading us today in the talk about forgiveness is Sheldon Smith.
Good morning and happy Tuesday, everyone. So, as Mike alluded to, today's topic is going to be forgiveness. And just to open it up, we live in a nation of grudges, from the Civil War to the Hatfields and McCoys. In entertainment, we have the Tupac versus Biggie Smalls conflict among followers. We have contemporary politics. We have so many things in the society that makes it seem as though we have lost, if we ever had the ability to settle differences in a civil manner. We see it every day. We see brawls, we see street fights, drive-by shootings, mass shootings, etc. And at the core of all of this is an inability to forgive. So I want to open up today's discussion with the following question: what is forgiveness? Glenn, would you like to open it up?
Sure. When you first ask that, as a Christian, I think into what I'm taught from Sunday school classes as a we taught, and I'm not sure I personally have ever been able to actually quite get to the forgive and forget that you're taught, that at least I was taught in Sunday school. But to forgive somebody so completely that you have wiped it off of your mind and you've completely forgotten that it ever happened. I think that's probably that's where my brain goes, initially.
Yeah, I don't think we're supposed to really forget it necessarily. I think I think there's boundaries. There's always boundaries, and I think you can allow people and yourself a chance to repair, to improve, to build through it. But to me, forgiveness just seems more like the first step of forgiveness anyway. Seems like it's just a decision, right? It's something that I have to just say that it's something I need to do, either for my sense of values or for my own physiological being.
Yeah,
Sue,
I think the question might be what is healthy. The question might be what is healthy forgiveness, what is godly forgiveness, which would be the same thing from a Christian standpoint. Godly forgiveness would be a healthy forgiveness. It is whether you deserve it or not, or no matter who I am or no matter who you are, I'm not going to hold this against you. I'm willing to restore a relationship and not let this come between us. And a little bit later, we might get into what I see in the media and on social media as kind of an insincere forgiveness, just trying to create a moment or recreate a moment. I'll give you an example. We've seen some video of very dramatic courtroom forgiveness where the parent of a murdered child will stand up and say, I forgive this man for murdering my child. I've seen some of those that I think are absolutely miraculous and probably sincere, and I've seen some that I don't think are sincere. They're just trying to, it's a naive trying to create a moment in a smarmy insincerity. And that's hard to judge sometime. So it gets back to what I was saying. Healthy forgiveness is probably what we need to define.
Mm.
Well, that's a good point. And, I want to make the point that forgiveness
Yeah, I
doesn't.
think
Can you hear me?
There's
I was just going to say forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean forgetting or excusing any harm that is done to you. It also doesn't necessarily mean making up with the person who causes you the harm, right? But what it does mean, I think, is it allows you to let go, because that anger and stuff, it starts to, and I know from personal experience, it starts to have a physical effect on you at some point.
Yeah.
I think Sue was about to say something.
yeah, I think it's about release. I think forgiveness is. Yeah, I think it's about release. I think forgiveness is about not owning it. And I don't mean not owning yourself. I mean not owning what someone else did. Right? Not absorbing and owning what they did to you. Just letting that part go and just working on how your response was. Right? Can you release someone else's actions enough that you can work on how you respond to these things? Because honestly, we can hope that there will never be slights, big and large. I don't think that's terribly realistic. If you can look at how you respond to things and use forgiveness as a way of that, of working on yourself. Because in my mind, a lot of times people assume, and this is what you were talking about, Kevin, about the insincerity. People assume that it's about someone else, right? It's about letting someone else off the hook or whatever. But I don't think it lets them off the hook. I think let them and let God figure out what their issues are over there, whatever God they have. Let them deal with their guilt and drama. If you can release it and just deal with yourself.
Absolutely. I have a friend who is absolutely, and that person's parents are dead and gone. Dead and gone. But he still can't let it go. They're in the grave. He still is harboring lots of anger toward them. He says he never could forgive them. And that holding on is not affecting those people because, like I said before, they're dead and gone, but they are still hindering him. And Sue, what you said sounds a lot like what the Mayo Clinic says on their website. They say the act that hurt or offended you might always be with you, and that kind of reflects something Glenn said earlier as well. But working on forgiveness can lessen that act's grip on you, which was what Sue was saying. And it can also help free you from the control that person has over you, the person who harmed you. Interesting, right?
Sheldon, I have a question.
Sure.
It kind of, listening to you guys chat, it kind of makes me wonder who is, when you talk about forgiveness, who's the one who benefits the most from forgiveness?
By all means, I would say, well, that's a two-way street, right? Because I know in my younger days, I did what I consider to be some horrible things. And thankfully, through Facebook, I've been able to get back in touch with people and apologize because I hold those things that I did internally. Now, the interesting part about it is sometimes they say, Sheldon, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So I've cooked it up in my mind to be more significant than it might have been. So in that sense, it alleviates me. But more importantly, I know things that, like things that I held against, my father, sometimes things I might have held against my mother for a long time when I was younger. But as long as I held on to those things, my life was always a disaster. But when I let him go, I was able to move forward.
Mm. I've had some heavy heart issues where I was in the past accused of something that was absolutely false and worked over for it and told that, maybe Jesus will forgive you, but I never will, was their statement. Right. And I was like, wow, okay, I didn't do it, but it caused me such a heaviness of heart. Mm-hmm. It really, emotionally, my spirit, everything, it was so deep and internal that I have to even take a deep breath as I think about it. Mm-hmm. And I also have had this place, and it's the emotional state of your soul, right? Mm-hmm. That is in conflict with your mind. And that's how I put it anyway. And that is where I've had a visceral hatred. Had in the past literally a visceral hatred of someone. And people said, Mike, you're a Christian. How could you do that? It's like, well, brother, I'm a human who has emotions like every other human. And I wanted to work through this. I knew that I felt like that from my faith and my values that I needed to, I wanted to, I sought advice on how to do it. I could not release it. I carried that and it became honestly like a shackle for me. I honestly thought in my mind of ways to hurt them. And it just continued. And I could tell by going through this process that it was hurting me. It was causing me worry. It was causing me anxiety. It was causing me to lose rest. And it was doing nothing to this person because even I had built this person up in the lack of communication and the cognitive dissonance, so to speak, between my soul and my mind. I had turned this person into a bigger monster than they really were. Right? And believe it or not, this same person I worked it out with and actually have good feelings toward now and get along with.
Wow.
Well, Mike, have you ever heard the term stewing?
Yeah.
Like in a crock pot? Well, sometimes I think we can, as long as we hold on to those things, they actually simmer. And sometimes those feelings even grow until some point at which either you resolve it or they explode. And going back to the Mayo Clinic, one of the things they say is that sometimes forgiveness might even lead to feelings of understanding, empathy, and compassion for the one you hurt, right? And so going back to the anger that I had toward my parents for this thing or that thing, right? I understand now, right? Once I was able to let go, I understand. And I appreciate their efforts and appreciate what they had to do and the decisions they had to make. So I can have an unfettered relationship with them. And I think, Mike, as you said, you can now have an unfettered relationship with that person with which you had a conflict.
Yeah. And you know what, though? You need to not be that person that goes, hey, you shouldn't feel that way. It's like, well, you know what? I feel this way. Right. And you when you're in the process, when you have this kind of trauma or thing going on, I call it a trauma, you may never have good feelings. That's why I said it's a decision. You don't always wake up every day feeling like you love everybody either. But people of faith are commanded to love their enemies even, right? So that Absolutely. In your marriage, even I had a teacher who said before I was married, she was from the Bahamas and she taught us literature, and she would come in and she would go, some days I don't feel like I'm in love with my husband, but I'm committed to love him, right? Because we can't base everything we do on a feeling of the moment. We have to make decisions based on what we think is right. And that ultimately, that's what got me through and helped me to reestablish a relationship because this person allowed for a new history to be built, right?
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies it, right? You have boundaries, but you can extend those boundaries of trust,
Mm-hmm.
or never. You can forgive and never allow that person back into a relationship. But that doesn't mean that you have to hold deep-seated resentment, bitterness, and hatred. I would be at that place where I would go, you know what? What I did was I made a decision. I even began to pray for this person. It changed my mental state to say, hey, you know what? I wish them the best. I pray for them to change. I pray for them success. I pray for me to change, for what I'm seeing wrong, because often, it takes two to tango, right? Sometimes you've got to be self-aware enough to realize that you could have contributed to this.
There's a real wise scripture that says, don't let a root of bitterness grow up in you. That's probably one of the most profound and wise pieces of advice that can ever be given, because this root of bitterness can take hold and then it's going to grow.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So sometimes, and it's not always pleasant to get rid of the roots, but they have to go.
Absolutely.
Nip it in the bud.
And Kevin, when you talk about roots, right? Once that negativity takes, it's going to spread to other aspects of your life. So negative feelings, it can crowd out any positive feelings you have in your mind, and all of a sudden you become a bitter person. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's accurate. I think that it's interesting too. You can talk about the degree of slight or attack or whatever it is that you're forgiving, right? It could be, easy to forgive someone for stepping on your foot in a line someplace. That's a pretty simple, easy forgiveness thing. The ones we struggle with are those ones that are deeper emotionally. Maybe not even physically, but deeper emotionally. Those really, like Mike was talking about earlier, those ones that really go right to your quick. And there's also this sense of injustice, right? It's not fair that they accuse me of, or that they did this to me. There's this, it's not fair thing, which we've been programmed to believe. I don't think that's true, but I think the world is not fair. But that assumption of fairness. And then there's the whole issue of applying assumptions to everything that we assume. It's what we've been talking about, how you just manifesting it in your head. You're making it much worse than it ever was. Maybe it wasn't intentional. We assume motives a lot. Right.
Yep.
And so we're trying to forgive something that wasn't even accurate.
Right.
Struggling with forgiving something that's not accurate.
Right. So, that's interesting, Sue. The fact that we just go ahead and assume things. And I think part of that might be that, especially as Americans, humility comes hard to us, right? And if we are full of ourselves, it's hard for us to have empathy for others. And what I used to always say at church is, if we empty ourselves of ourselves, then it's easier for us to see and empathize the other person. And something happened at work last week where a coworker, that we were on an interagency call, and that coworker went off on me. And so after that call, people were pinging me. They were saying, wow, that was terrible. I'm sorry that she did that. But the thing is, and what I told one person is, a lot of times when people lash out like that, it has very little to do with the recipient of that action. It has more to do with what's going on with that person. And, and a lot of times we just don't know. And so when they ask how I could be so calm about it, that's why.
Yeah. Sue talked about the spectrum of feelings and forgiveness, I think, a moment ago. And I kept thinking about and everyone's in a different category, whether it be, say, with a spouse that cheated on you. I know people have come back together. Some people can't. But I mean, you could still forgive at some point. Perhaps you could forgive, but even that is a lower level. I looked at some cases where there were Jewish Holocaust survivors who forgave their Nazi guards and developed relationships with them and visited over the years, or someone that's in prison that murdered their child, and they went to visit them and forgave them and spoke to them and didn't allow it to evolve into a monster, or for them to sit at their house imagining this vicious anonymous stranger in their mind. They confronted it, they forgave, and they tried to look at another human in the eyes, that even if they didn't accept it, I mean, I think you need to have that forgiveness, make that decision within your own heart and mind, right? And I've heard people sometimes, I don't know that this is the way it should be done. I think not, where people go, I forgive you. And they're like, well, I didn't ask for your forgiveness. Okay, well, okay, maybe that should have been more of an internal voice going on. Because sometimes we say nice things and they're used as weapons. We weaponize polite language. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Well, Mike, I have an excellent example of that. I remember one morning I was on the way to work, and you know how the McDonald's, the drive-through, they have 2 lanes, right? And so I'd already put my order in, and I was supposed to merge back into the one line next. And this car shoots in front of me, right? And so, my window was open. I was like, I forgive you, and it wasn't in a very nice way. But I'm going to tell you when I felt bad. When I got up to the window and got ready to pay, the lady said, oh, your meal has already been paid for. I was like, oh, gosh. So the guy in front of me paid for my meal, and I felt pretty small after that.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned something in my neighborhood, at least where my roots are, in Hatfield and McCoy country, and that had to be a very difficult time for those families, because most of them fought for the Confederacy. I mean, almost both sides, almost the entirety of both sides fought for the Confederacy, except for one person. Right. And that was the brother who fought for the Union that came back, that was killed. And that was sort of what kicked off the feud, where, they killed a Union brother. And then later, as if, that wasn't enough, all they needed was a spark. I think there was, after that, there was a stolen or shot pig. Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way it is in our life. Something big happens, and then all it takes is, you to just say something, just slight me in the smallest way, and it can start the biggest of the feuds. Now, could they or should they have forgiven that? They were in the midst of a very emotional battle and struggle, amidst most of what was going on, them not really knowing what the political ramifications were, except that they had split sides and somebody killed their brother. And most people aren't most people care more about the person beside them and their family than they care about some huge political issue. You ask a guy in battle who he's fighting for, and he says, the guy beside me and the guy beside me.
Right. I have an interesting thought experiment here. I'm thinking back during the last 25 years or so, there seemed to have been a punctuated period where politicians were apologizing for things that happened hundreds of years ago. And I'm wondering if the people who were affected have had a chance to forgive the system who wronged them. institutional forgiveness, if that's a thing.
Right, right, and that's an interesting concept, right? Because I think it's easy to forgive the people, right? And there's a broad range of circumstances during that time. You had people that treated their slaves a lot better than some others. You had people who gave their slaves significant amounts of money or land at the end of slavery, and others didn't. But I think people have an issue with the government, and the government having not only ever issued a formal apology or honored the commitments they were made during Reconstruction, but the fact that that there are others who, when we talk about moving on, yes, we want to move on, but as a group, just like Native Americans and everyone else, there needs to be some formal closure on the things that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, a lot of times payment is like.
Well, it's also about sincerity, right? It's a question about sincerity, and also expectations on all sides. I mean, the ability to forgive is different from the ability to accept that forgiveness, right? And that's what you're talking about if you're talking about reparations or any number of those larger scale things. I think on both sides, it's about sincerity. It's what you were talking about earlier, Kevin, about those kind of flip requests, oh, I'm sorry, or forgive me, or, those kind. And in some ways, the more removed you are from it, size wise, the larger the government response is or whatever. You're just not immediately connected to an individual slight. I think it's harder to believe the sincerity of the act, and then actions speak louder than words. So you can say it all day long, but if you don't back it up, if you tell me that you forgive me for some slight that I did to you, intentionally or not, and then you proceed to seek revenge to me or keep me down in some way over that same issue, how am I supposed to believe that? And I'm not talking reparations. I'm just talking in general spirit.
Yeah.
There has to be a sense of trust. I think it's harder to regain trust when you have been slighted and you are trying to accept forgiveness.
Yeah, I think that, just touching on that, and I stay with my family back in the Hatfield and McCoy country, they did not trust the government because they did not have good social services. They didn't have great school systems. They weren't treated fairly and well back in Appalachia, the area of the country that I'm from. They were drawn into issues and circumstances because they were recruited out of it and into it. And, when you look at forgiveness, I've had this conversation, I think maybe even Sheldon and I have, regarding the Civil War and reparations. We had another program that we did and was deleted and will redo. Maybe completely about reparations. I think that would be a good longer conversation. But say like in the Christian faith, ultimate forgiveness before God is considered to have been paid in blood sacrifice, right? Even in pagan days, there were blood sacrifices that were given, or in ancient Jewish days, a lamb was given, paid for in blood. And it seems to me that during the Civil War that we paid a huge blood price as well, a huge blood price. And there should have been better treatment. There should have been forgiveness. As a matter of fact, when you read a lot of the things from Frederick Douglass and the people from back then, they talked about the forgiveness and growing, integrating and moving into society as one. And with Martin Luther King Jr. and all of that language, a people that are united together. But if we forever demand an apology, or we forever demand a payment, we will forever be divided, because there's going to continue to be those people that will not forgive, just like we were talking about. There will be those people who will forgive, but don't think that they are sorry for what happened, but don't believe that they were in any way involved, and
Right.
don't want to pay people because they are red or brown or black. If a connection could be directly made to a family that was demonstrably damaged, and we know socially that a lot of families have been damaged one way or another historically. The cycle could go on and on forever.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely,
When
and
we do
you
something,
know,
I can
I can.
say,
I was going to say I can certainly understand both sides. I think a thought to consider is so in the early days of this country, and I've learned a lot through my ancestry search. Through the early days of this country could not have been built without slavery. And we know that Africans were first brought here as indentured servants. And even the slavery in the Bible, it allowed a jubilee every 7 years. So a person would be freed every 7 years, right? They were bond servants. But what happened after the Virginia Slave Codes is they instituted the system of chattel slavery. So while this country was being built and while wealth was being built, it was being the people who were upon whose backs the wealth were built. They weren't being able to benefit from the building of that wealth. And then later on, through institutional practices, redlining, the fact that during after World War II, Black veterans couldn't get VA home loans, so these new suburban communities were they were excluded and left in cities where property, so all of this stuff, it's a result of national policy. And so there was harm done because of national policy. So therefore, just like if you were hurt in an automobile accident, right? Insurance or the courts are to make you whole. And so I think proponents of reparations just want to make people whole, who are the descendants of slaves specifically.
Mm-hmm. I think most of us agree that we want to raise all ships without requiring stay stagnant or to come down. I think that's how I would feel. I think that the lottery has proven that you can't just throw money at people and be successful.
You got that right.
So I had this conversation with another Kevin friend of mine, a Black enlisted guy that I was stationed with in Germany and in Afghanistan, and we discussed opportunities. I think we do need for women. Women could be seeking reparations. Women didn't get the right to vote till like 50 to 70 years after African American men. And what do? It's really absurd. We could not pay for all the reparations that people would eventually demand. It can't happen. But can we build programs? Can we forgive and look at each other as a people and say, you know what? Women weren't treated right in the last 100 years. Give them educational opportunities, scholarships, grants for those, what do you call it? A leg up, opportunity to succeed.
Well, that's interesting, Mike, because you're talking about institutionally, you're talking about in a large scale, in terms of conversation of reparations. But if you get that right back down to an individual level on any issue, you were talking earlier about issue on all of these, can you best? It doesn't matter how large a topic it is, whether it's reparations or whether it's infidelity in a marriage. Can you rebuild trust? It can rebuild trust with a parent that has, injured them on purpose. Whatever, right? From bad to good. Can you rebuild trust? And so that becomes a lot more than a topic of can you afford it? It's more like, can you not afford it? I mean, can you afford not to?
Absolutely.
I think that what Sue
Kevin?
is bringing out here is that forgiveness is a process. It's not I forgive you and then boom, it's done.
Yeah.
Then there's some then the work begins. So, if you want the healing to begin, it begins with forgiveness. But then there's a step-by-step process. There's not even the potential for healing if there's no forgiveness.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Get rid of the root, but you still have to deal with what put the root there in the first place.
Yeah. And really,
So there's a step-by-step process.
government can't forgive you. Only people can. Right. So,
Right.
and the thing is with monies, and I say keep it at my level. I help people. I treat people. I forgive people. I treat people as I want to be treated. I give to programs. I look. I want to help people get ahead. I do that in a mentorship type of way. If I see people in my organization who if some need it more than others, I spend time with them. So we don't have to always go to, you see on TV now, and I think things that upset people is that, in California, they're starting to look at the absurdity of it, because there's people saying, well, you know what, I think $7.5 million would be enough. It's like, enough for what? Enough, you need to be taught how to fish, not to be handed a buttload of fish, right? You need, if you haven't been taught to fish, you need to learn how to create a fish business, how to fish correctly, how to integrate something that is sustainable. Just giving people handouts is not a sustainable program.
Well, the government made a promise after the Civil War, and they reneged on that promise, and that still needs to be made right. And how do you do it? I don't know. But I will say, and I alluded to it before, different families fared differently, right? And I talked about the two sides of my family. My father was, in essence, in slavery up until the 60s when he finally left home, joined the Navy, and went to college, right? And never went back to that town. It was so bad that in the mornings, the people who owned the property would come in and throw water on him to get him up, right? I mean, it was just that bad. They weren't able to accumulate property. In fact, I saw records where they ended up transferring property to the people that they worked for, right? Because of just how that system was built. You could never get ahead. The people owned the store, so they had to buy stuff from the store. They could never get ahead, ever, right? Yeah. Whereas on my mother's side, right, the guy who was, I think he was a prominent doctor or something like that. Well, whatever the case, my ancestor handled his money for him. So I guess you might consider him a house slave. But he was given enough money to buy 300 acres. And so that side of the family started the tradition of ownership, property ownership, and independence far before my father's side, right? And so you can see the difference having done the right thing in the beginning would have made bringing us to this point. And so, and things have gotten so bad for some, right? How do you fix that, right? And Democrats and Republicans are failing on this because the Democrats, what they're doing is making it worse, right? And I think, the most sensible people when it comes to addressing issues end up being Republicans. But, it's just, but getting back to our topic, right? So, I held no grudges against people because people are just that. And being able to form these relationships, no grudges against people. But moving back to our topic, right? There are some benefits to forgiveness. And what are some of the benefits you guys can think of regarding forgiveness?
You move on and you grow.
You'll sleep better at night, If you're holding a grudge against somebody, your stomach juices are going to act up and give you an ulcer. In the meantime, the person you're holding a grudge against, it's not hurting them at all. They're hiking on a mountain somewhere, having a great time, and you're stewing in your juices. Yeah, there are physical effects.
Yeah,
it's kind of a funny thing because I must have a really forgiving nature because I don't hold grudges. I definitely have family members who hold grudges, and I know that they bring things up over and over and over of people who have hurt them. But man, I just can't let it bug me. And
Mhm.
so listening to this conversation, I know that there are so many different kinds of people out there, but do you know people that it just washes off their back and then just, yeah, I just take them for how they are. And if they're going to hold a grudge, they're going to hold a grudge. And if they're not, they're not.
Mhm. Yeah,
Hmm.
I guess that's true. And to some, in some respect, um, you have people that were involved in conflicts that continue to hold grudges against a people type, right? Like you have people from World War II, older veterans who had a very difficult time speaking to Germans or Japanese people who died, um, hating them or disliking them greatly or not wanting anything to do with them. People in Vietnam who saw anyone who looked Asian as suspect because of their experiences that they went through. In some ways, that's a long grudge. We've actually been, we stopped importing slaves about 10 or 15 years after we became a nation. We did away with slavery about 60 years later. And then we've progressively started to move through and get better. We need to keep getting better, but we can't hold a 158-year grudge because it's been 158 years since then. Something should have been done for the people that were then, who were alive then. But the only thing we can do now is, as a people, as a Christian people, is to realize that sins in the past were done, work to reconcile, look to improve. I think people get kind of hot and bothered when they're competitive people or they're people trying to protect their own finances and they see that, they don't believe that they weren't even in this country when any of that happened, nor any of their ancestors. And now they're going to be taxed heavily to pay for $5 to $7.5 million per person for something that's not forgiven. It's not, and it's like that money payment will somehow change people's hearts.
So Mike, I don't want this. I don't want the episode to end without remembering that America didn't only harm Black people. America harmed the indigenous folk who were here. They harmed the Irish. They harmed the Chinese. They harmed the Catholics. I mean, there's a huge long list of people who America has hurt systemically. The biggest and the hardest one is I think the slavery one. But I mean, we've not kept our promises to the indigenous folks of America.
Well, think about what was happening in the 1700s everywhere around the world.
Right? Yeah. Colonialism has never been a good thing.
Mary Queen of Scott, and with Henry VIII, and with all the attacks of the Crusades and everything that was going on. There were slaves being brought out of Scotland and Ireland into the colonies. There were bonds. There were different kinds of slaves. There were slaves that were being sold by other Africans to the American colonies. It's so complex for us to try to pay for it with a dollar amount is where I think the distaste gets in people's mouths. I want to forgive, but I don't want to say, you know what, Kevin, if you forgive me, I'll give you $100. You know what?
Yeah.
Hey, right on, brother. You know what?
Yeah.
Good to go. $100 and you're forgiven.
And I think the farther away you get from it, the more difficult it's going to be to address the harm that was caused by it, right? Because a lot of what you see, people being stuck in places like Chicago after all the jobs and stuff leave, a lot of what you see is a direct result of history. And the other thing is the breaking up of families in a nation where, the Constitution, it it must have been a lie, because all men weren't created equally, right?
Yeah.
And not everyone was eligible for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So, I think somehow the nation still needs to make it right. That's not a matter of forgiveness, but that's more a matter of accountability, right?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we need to make it right for a color type or a sex. I think we need to make it right for all people who don't have opportunities, who were left behind in one way or another. Because there's so many stories there that are not attached. They're just attached to human blood, and if this line continues to be pursued, it will only divide our country. So we do need to have this time where we forgive, we look to build, and stop planting a white flag or a brown flag or a red flag. We need, if we don't, it's not going to be settled in a Christian manner, because the people that are most vicious about it are not necessarily approaching it from a Christian point of view. It's going to become a very divisive wedge in our society that won't be productive. I as a Christian person, I want us to be productive.
Absolutely.
I want anyone who, any family line that was held back from slavery, I want them to have opportunities to move ahead. But we don't do any group well by allowing. If you listen to Thomas Sowell speak, brilliant African-American academic out of Stanford, at least he used to be at Stanford, they try to let certain groups into schools based on their race, and it hurt them, because they were getting in based on their color, not based on their academic credentials or ability to succeed there. So that ultimately hurting them. We need to work through our schools, make the schools safer and stronger and better, improve business opportunities, like we did for the Afghanistan women when we were in Afghanistan, that it's recently been taken away. We've got to do that for people who have not had opportunities. And we don't want to dismiss history. We can't pay for history. We have to pay for success now. We have to build a structure that allows us all to succeed.
I'm so thankful that I had the benefit of, well, number one, teachers who pushed me, right? And also, Army ROTC, the Army ROTC Scholarship Program had what's called the Quality Enrichment Program, which at historically Black colleges and universities, students could take these extra classes to get caught up on those areas in which they were weak. And so I was a beneficiary of that, right? Because, and that led to opportunities for success for me, right? And so, it's things like that were put in place that help people excel, right? But, going back to the topic of forgiveness, right? So as we're talking about from an academic sense, I was reading information from the Harvard Medical School, and they said that there are two types of forgiveness. There's decisional and there's emotional. And with the decisional forgiveness, that involves making a conscious choice to replace or supplant the animosity with goodwill. And with the emotional forgiveness, it's just a matter of drifting away from those feelings that were caused by the offense and no longer dwelling on it, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
And so, what are your thoughts on that?
You can't say the Lord's Prayer, without reading that line.
Right.
Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Nothing emotional about it at that point. You're saying, I acknowledge that I need to forgive just as God forgave me. And he was the model. I don't know if you guys have seen some of this YouTube video of Jim Carrey, the actor. I don't know what's going on with him, but he's having some kind of a spiritual renewal in his life. He claims to be a Buddhist Christian or whatever. He's talking a lot about forgiveness in some of his videos, and I've just kind of scanned through them. Forgiveness is a real big thing with him, and he even talked about Christ's forgiveness on the cross. And I'm going, this is Jim Carrey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so apparently he's come into a time in his life when forgiveness has become extremely important. Something's going on with him that forgiveness has become very important. But decisional and emotional, there's a huge, the decisional might need to come first, and then the emotional may or may not follow.
Yeah.
Probably will as the healing begins.
Well,
if it's a relationship.
The example I gave earlier, Sheldon, was that spectrum that I went through of the hatred, right? The hatred and having feelings of wanting to do harm to this person. As a Christian, I had that fundamental foundation of duty and responsibility that said that I needed to forgive, I should forgive, right? There was an ought there, right? So that you look at society, and even in week before last, I saw someone on TV at one of the town halls where they were saying reparations have not been made. That's why we're going to rob and steal from the stores.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. But if you don't have a attitude of forgiveness, you're going to have an attitude of get evenness, right? And that is what I was trying to talk about earlier. We can't have an attitude of get evenness, because even as individual beings, Sheldon, you were a major, much smarter than me as an enlisted guy, right? So we're not even in that sense. You outrank in the military.
Mike, Air Force non-commissioned officers are like Army officers, but go ahead.
Well, hey, God bless you. We were talking before the show that, my dad was Marine, and he always says simplify. So for the Air Force, I always go simplify. So anyway, my comedy will begin at 1 o'clock. So come back for the funny parts.
Yeah.
So, we've got to forgive. If we don't forgive, there is going to be conflict. We had that one major conflict that nearly ripped our country apart. And in Lincoln's words, our better angels, took part or participated. And our better angels need to listen to the Lord now and lead us on a path of recovery and discovery, and how to wake up and see each other as one blood, as the Bible talks about in Acts, that we are one blood and we're one people and we're God's people. And we can't be an us them pronoun based society, right?
Right.
We can't be, and that's where it goes. We've had that show on neo-Marxism. We can't be, it, her, him, he, they, we. It's.
Well, for those of us who write for a living, it makes things hard. But we were talking earlier about replacing ill feelings with positive ones, and so reflecting on Philippians 4:8, where it says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good report or repute, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things." And so that is that kind of lines up with some of the other things that we've been reading, like from the Mayo Clinic, for instance. It talks about letting go, right? And that leads to healthier relationships, improved mental health, less anxiety, stress, fewer symptoms of depression, lower blood pressure, a stronger immune system, improved health, improved self-esteem. Wow, right? So there are spiritual and there are physical implications to letting go, of forgiving, right? And we talked a little bit earlier, as we get ready to close, about the role of humility, right? And humility is not. This is a good way to put it. Humility is not. It's about thinking about me less, and it's not about thinking about me less. It's about thinking less about me, right? And so it's a matter of emptying ourselves of ourselves so that we can have empathy for others. And humility enables a person to put the interests of others before his or her own. And that's also a biblical principle. Two people who approach conflict with humility will always find a peaceful resolution. So with that said, why is it that conflicts prevail so much in our society today?
Why do conflicts prevail in our society today?
Right. Yeah, we'll open up about, the Hatfields, McCoys, the Tupac versus Biggie, and both of them end up being killed.
Everybody feels like they've been hurt in some way, physically, financially, emotionally.
Doesn't our society kind of reward the victim mentality?
Yeah.
Yep. That's what I like about. We could do a whole show, and I'd like to hear an expert on this. They're talking about corporate forgiveness. We've touched on that. It's if we are personifying something that can't be personified. But there's a symbol there. There's something symbolic, and often you hear of a church offering, asking forgiveness for something that was done in the Middle Ages. And things like that. So this corporate forgiveness is very interesting. But for one thing, it's symbolic and creates an atmosphere conducive to forgiveness. And so why is there so much conflict? Well, because people need to read that verse in Philippians, Sheldon, that you just, and the verse in Hebrews about not letting a root of bitterness. And so we need to spread the news. That's why I'm glad Jim Carrey, as popular as he is, has got millions of views talking about forgiveness, and we need to do it. So,
well, he had a rough childhood, didn't he?
I think so. He lived in a car for a while, and growing up in Canada is hard enough, but but it was cold. I think he had from a real poor.
We just lost all our Canadian viewers. Thanks, Kevin.
Love you, Canada. love you, Canada.
Hey. Okay. All right. Hey, any closing comments, Sheldon, as we wrap up here?
Well, hey, I think this was a really great discussion, and thank you for letting me choose the topic today. Forgiveness has been a very important thing for me, and like I said before, my life has changed since I learned how to let these things go, and it's made me a better person. Yeah,
we've talked about relationships, right? We've talked about people being hurt in conflicts and the Holocaust and slavery and reparations and other forms of things where we've just hurt each other through history and ways that we pay for it, right? Physically and emotionally.
Right.
And we always have to look for opportunities to rebuild, to rebuild relationships. That's how I see it anyway. And if we're doing things that are not conducive to trying to positively build relationships, we're not doing ourselves any justice. We're not doing the world any justice. Glenn, any last words?
Yeah, I think that the listening to both sides of this, and I kind of think that when you forgive, you probably get more out of it than when you forgive somebody else. The other person that you're forgiving, it isn't why you're forgiving. You're forgiving it for the energy that is released, the negative energy that is released from you, and the opening up of the positive energy that's allowed to pour into you.
Right. They may not even know. Kevin?
I'd like to ask Canada to forgive me for saying that about Jim Carrey. Canada is one of my favorite spots. I love to go up there, especially when it's really cold. And so I just had to do that little dig. But my final word is there may be somebody that that comes to mind after seeing this podcast that you need to go to and ask their forgiveness for something. Maybe something you haven't thought about. So let the healing begin.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That self-awareness, even before communion, if you're at a church that does communion, you seek your heart, right, before you take communion before God, because you're just not going to think of everything. I mean, we sin every day, we do wrong things every day, but we don't want to.
Right.
I don't want to. So you go before. Right. I want to come before my friends, with a clean heart. I want to come before God with a clean heart. I want to approach how I rebuild and trust people with that pure and uncynical of a heart. And I'm a cynic, okay? I don't want to be. I want to trust people. I want to allow the Lord to, and that's what we've got to do. And I think we've had a good discussion. We forgive the technology that booted you, and we forgive the technology that would not allow Melissa Sturdivant in, who wanted to be here. And we'll try to again the next time. Thanks, guys. That'll wrap it up for The Real Squabble. I highly encourage you to research these subjects on your own. Leave us your messages. Let us know what you think. Maybe we've missed some aspects that we didn't think that we could pass on to others. Thank you for joining The Real Squabble.
Good job, Shel.